Our first story takes place in a small, remote cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Sarah and James were a young couple looking to escape the stress of their busy lives. They rented this cabin for a quiet weekend getaway, hoping to reconnect with nature and each other. The cabin was beautiful, surrounded by thick woods, with a stunning view of the mountains. It seemed like the perfect place to relax. The first day was everything they had hoped for. They spent their time hiking, cooking together, and enjoying the peace that only nature can provide. But as the sun set and the sky darkened, a sense of unease began to settle over them. It was the kind of feeling that creeps up on you slowly, like the realization that you're being watched. That night, as they were getting ready for bed, Sarah heard a faint tapping sound. At first, she thought it was just a branch hitting the window, but when the tapping continued, she called James over to listen. The tapping grew louder, more deliberate, and it was clear it wasn't just the wind. James, trying to stay calm, approached the window to see what was causing the noise. What he saw made his blood run cold. Just outside the window, barely visible in the darkness, was a shadowy figure. It wasn't moving, just standing there. Staring into the cabin, James froze, unsure of what to do. The figure was tall and dark, with no distinguishable features, almost like a shadow given life. Sarah joined him at the window and gasped when she saw the figure. They couldn't make out a face or any details, just the silhouette of a person standing there. James tried to reassure Sarah, telling her it was probably just a prank or someone lost in the woods, but even he didn't believe that. They decided to ignore it, hoping the figure would go away. They drew the curtains and went to bed, but neither of them could sleep. Every creak of the old cabin made them jump. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Then, the tapping started again, this time on the window by the bed. James grabbed a flashlight and, against Sarah's pleas, decided to go outside to confront whoever, or whatever, was out there. As he opened the door, the cold night air rushed in, sending a shiver down his spine. He stepped outside, shining the flashlight around, but saw nothing. The figure was gone. Relieved, James went back inside, but the sense of unease didn't leave. They stayed up the rest of the night, alert to every sound. When dawn finally broke, they packed their things and left the cabin, cutting their trip short. They didn't say much on the drive home, both too shaken to talk about what had happened. A few days later, still disturbed by the experience, Sarah decided to look up the area where they had stayed. She discovered that several people had reported seeing a similar shadowy figure near the cabin. Some described it as a ghost, others as something even darker, but no one could explain what it was or why it appeared. All they knew was that it seemed to be drawn to that cabin, appearing to anyone who stayed there. Sarah and James never went back to that cabin. The memory of that shadowy figure stayed with them, a constant reminder that some places are better left alone. They often wondered what would have happened if they had stayed another night. Would the figure have become more aggressive? Would they have seen more than just a shadow? They never found out, and they never wanted to. Our next story is about Mark, a man who loved the outdoors. He was an experienced hiker and camper, someone who felt more at home in the wilderness than in the city. So when he heard about a remote cabin in the Pacific Northwest, surrounded by nothing but forest for miles, he couldn't resist booking it for a week. He wanted to disconnect from the world and enjoy the solitude. The cabin was old, with creaky floors and walls that seemed to grown with age. It was exactly what Mark had been looking for, a place where he could be completely alone with his thoughts. The first night was peaceful. He made a fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat outside listening to the sounds of the forest. The quiet was comforting, a welcome change from the constant noise of the city. But on the second night, something changed. As Mark was lying in bed, he heard a soft whisper. It was so faint that at first, he thought it was just the wind, but the sound persisted. It seemed to be coming from the walls, almost as if the cabin itself was speaking. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just his imagination, but the whispering grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just noise, it was voices, though he couldn't make out what they were saying. By the third night, the whispers had become impossible to ignore. They were clearer now, as if multiple people were talking at once, their voices overlapping in a disturbing cacophony. Mark tried to rationalize it. Maybe the cabin was haunted by the spirits of those who had lived there before. But that didn't make sense. Why would they be so restless? On the fourth night, the whispers took a darker turn. Mark started hearing his name being called out, mixed with other words like leave and danger. The voices sounded desperate, almost pleading, as if they were trying to warn him about something. Mark's fear grew, but he didn't want to leave. He was determined to finish his week in the cabin, convinced that his mind was playing tricks on him. However, on the fifth night, something happened that Mark couldn't explain away. As he was sitting by the fire, trying to drown out the whispers with music, the cabin door suddenly burst open. It wasn't the wind. The door had been securely locked. Mark rushed to close it, but as he did, he felt a cold presence behind him, like someone was standing just inches away, watching him. Panicked, Mark grabbed his belongings and fled the cabin, not stopping until he reached his car. He drove all night, not looking back once. When he finally made it back to civilization, he was exhausted and terrified, but relieved to be away from that cabin. A few days later, Mark shared his experience with a local historian who told him that the cabin had a dark history. It was built on land where a massacre had taken place hundreds of years ago, and it was believed that the spirits of those who died still haunted the area. The whispers Mark heard were likely the voices of those lost souls trapped in the cabin, warning anyone who stayed there to leave before it was too late. Mark never went back to that cabin, and he never spent another night alone in the woods. The experience changed him, making him question everything he thought he knew about the wilderness. He often wondered what might have happened if he had stayed just one more night. Would the whispers have turned into something more? Would he have encountered the spirits face to face? It was a question he was glad he never had to answer. The final story is one that has haunted Emma for years. Emma was a college student who, along with her friends, decided to spend their spring break at a cabin in the woods. It was supposed to be a fun getaway, a chance to relax, hike, and enjoy each other's company. The cabin was perfect for their needs, isolated and surrounded by nature. The first few days were exactly what they had hoped for. They spent their time exploring the woods, swimming in the nearby lake, and sitting around the fire, telling stories late into the night. But on the third night, something happened that none of them were prepared for. Emma woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. At first, she thought it was one of her friends coming back from the bathroom, but when she looked out the window, she saw a man standing at the edge of the woods. He was just standing there, staring at the cabin. The man was tall, with ragged clothes and unkempt hair. His eyes were wide and wild, and he didn't move or speak. Emma's heart raced as she watched him, unsure of what to do. She woke up her friends, but by the time they looked out the window, the man was gone. They tried to convince themselves it was just a drifter or someone lost in the woods, but the unease stayed with them. The next day, they found strange symbols carved into the trees around the cabin, symbols they didn't recognize. They didn't know what they meant, but they felt ominous, like a warning. That night, the man returned. This time, he was closer to the cabin, standing just a few feet from the porch. Emma and her friends were terrified. They locked all the doors and windows, but they knew that wouldn't keep him out if he wanted to get in. They debated leaving, but it was the middle of the night, and the nearest town was miles away. Instead, they decided to call the police. When the officers arrived, the man was gone again, leaving no trace. The police didn't find anything unusual, but they told the group that there had been reports of a hermit living in the woods, a man who had lost his family in a fire years ago and had since gone mad. The officers warned them to be careful but didn't seem too concerned. The group tried to continue their vacation, but the atmosphere had changed. The fun was gone, replaced by a constant sense of dread. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that the man was still out there, waiting for the right moment. On the last night of their stay, the man came back. This time, he was standing right on the porch, staring through the window at them. His eyes were filled with anger, and he looked like he was ready to break down the door. Emma and her friends were paralyzed with fear, unsure of what to do. But then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the man turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. They didn't sleep that night, staying awake until the first light of dawn. As soon as it was bright enough, they packed up and left the cabin, vowing never to return. Later, they found out that other groups who had stayed in that cabin had also encountered the man, and some of them had even disappeared without a trace. Emma couldn't stop thinking about the look in his eyes, a look of pure madness. She often wondered what would have happened if they had stayed just one more night. Would the man have come back? Would they have been able to escape? It was a question that haunted her for years, a reminder that some places are best left undisturbed. These stories remind us that even in the most beautiful places, danger can lurk in the shadows. The next time you're tempted to escape to a cabin in the woods, remember these tales and think twice before you go.